We are recording. Awesome. Welcome everyone to our last webinar series of 2022. I'm Lane Mosier. I'm the program coordinator at the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. Our speaker today is Mary Hammes. She is the Reforestation Strategy Manager with the Nature Conservancy. She has a bit more robust introduction than I can give her, but I'll just throw it to Mary.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lane. Well, let me get my screen share set up here. And start the presentation. Looking good? All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Like Lane said, I am Mary Hammes, and I am here this morning to talk to you a bit about a vision called Minnesota Million. So first, I want to start off by introducing myself a bit more. I've spent the past 7 years in the floodplain forest of the Mississippi River working for Mississippi Park Connection as their stewardship manager and bringing volunteers down into the floodplain forest to address the loss of ash trees and regeneration issues with cottonwood trees. And I'm really anchored by the Mississippi River and all issues associated with it. So while I'm here today talking to you about forestry, reforestation, I know that I have a broader view and that people, wildlife, and water are so much a part of this conversation, as well as trees and forest systems. A bit about the land that I will be speaking about today and the lands where the Nature Conservancy of Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota does our work, specifically in Minnesota, or what is now called Minnesota. I want to acknowledge the original stewards of this land, the original caretakers, and those Native people who continue to care for this land, alongside our commitment to follow the leadership of our 11 Native nations and Indigenous people in doing reforestation work in a good way and incorporating traditional ecological knowledge into what we are trying to do. So, Minnesota Million, 1 million acres, where does that come from? You don't have to take my word for it. Minnesota Million is an idea that's been around since at least the early 2010s. Here's a few of the reports that sort of originated this idea. One coming from the Minnesota Forest Resources Council, another from Dovetail Partners, and then finally one from TNC's own Susan Cook Patton. These different reports really detailed how we might use reforestation as a tool to sequester carbon and as one of the tools in our toolbox to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. Of course, acknowledging also that these are not the only way that we can mitigate climate change, but just one of the tools in our toolbox. These reports really started out by looking at the geography of Minnesota and how many acres, how much land might be appropriate to reforest. Oops, I want that to be in your way. Sorry, I'm just moving this little face box around. There we go. So the different opportunity areas came out to be different amounts of acres, ranging from 7 million acres down to 3 million acres. And these are really looking at areas that were formerly forested that could be reforested. After in 2020, American Forests and the Nature Conservancy released what's called the Reforestation Hub. We found some more local data that indicated that about 3 million acres of Minnesota is probably the most appropriate amount to reforest. So this map shows that 3 million acre area running from northwestern Minnesota down to southeastern Minnesota along the prairie forest edge. In the eastern broadleaf forest here is outlined in orange, just to sort of give you a general idea of geography. Of course, we know that there's these little dark green spots all over the state, and so it doesn't exactly follow that line. But this was our best data that we could find in looking at how could we reforest in areas that are not prairie, not high quality grassland, but more areas that are degraded or formerly forested that are no longer, thinking about marginal agriculture land that's not being used to its fullest use, and looking at different remote sensing data like land ownership, historic land cover type, distance from prairie patches, soils, all of that good stuff. And so we came up with this 3 million acre area. And as a ambitious, really big, hairy, audacious goal, we think that we can reforest 1 million of those acres by 2045. We know that we need really big action to start to sequester carbon, to continue to sequester carbon in order to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. And so we propose that we could reforest 1 million of those acres by 2045, which would take 326,000, the equivalent of 326,000 cars off the road. We propose doing this at densities appropriate for the different land cover types. And this represents about 3/4 billion trees. It's really only a part of what we need to do, but it's a really big opportunity. And all of you here today know that planting trees and growing forests can do so much more than just sequester carbon. So we know that reforestation is one of the biggest natural climate solutions, biggest opportunities to sequester carbon when compared to some of the other practices that we see out there. But we also know that reforestation brings along all these other incredible benefits. And so it's really kind of a no regrets step towards sequestration of carbon. And we're excited to continue to build out a coalition to work towards this goal. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about the coalition that we are building and how we propose that this might get done. And looking forward to a robust discussion at the end of my talk about how you all could be involved. So back in 2021, TNC convened the folks listed here to really start out a conversation about how we could do this. And I just want to take a pause and thank everyone listed here for their vision, bringing together their data, their ideas to start to put some meat on the bones of this big vision. In addition to the folks listed here, we did a number of one-on-one conversations and focus groups to community groups. And one of the big findings as we went through this engagement process was, well, shoot, we don't have everybody we need at the table in this technical advisory committee. We really need to grow out our partnerships and get more folks to the table and in leadership positions to make this work sustainable and bring in all different kinds of Minnesotans. And so the first thing on the list of what will it take is partnerships. We are proposing a coalition that is not led by TNC, but is more of a leaderful model and is inclusive of all kinds of different interests, because we know that this is a really huge undertaking. We estimate it'll take about $1.7 billion. That's a conservative estimate and includes the maintenance needed long-term to ensure that the trees we plant in the forests that we plant grow and survive. We know we're going to need significant reinvestment in seed collection, seedling growing, outreach to landowners and delivery programs that service them, and then ongoing stewardship, like I mentioned before. Partnerships. So this map may show up sort of small to you all, but hopefully you can see it. One of the opportunities that we noticed as we were kind of combing through the data and is that there are 200,000 acres of this opportunity area that our remote sensing data found on tribal nation land. So that's 20% of our potential goal. And so we've been engaging with the tribal nations of Minnesota to better understand what their goals are for reforestation and how we might work together to meet those goals. Red Lake Nation in particular has a really incredible tree seedling growing facility. They currently grow only conifers, but are interested in diversifying their offerings. And we have a lot of shared goals with the tribal nations of Minnesota, including job skills training programs, job creation, and so on. Of course, it's not just tribal nations that we need to partner with, but other community groups. And so we're really excited to continue to work with some of the partners listed here, many of whom have their own reforestation goals, and figuring out how we can merge those goals to reach this really audacious goal together. So what is it going to take financially? As I put this slide up, I'm really excited to announce that as we know that we're going to need to fundraise about $1.78 billion, we did just receive a really exciting award from the USDA to grow out a network of seed collectors and tree seedling growers in Minnesota. So I just found out about that last week, and we submitted that proposal back in June. So it's all kind of a little bit of a whirlwind. It was a bit of a long shot, and here we are with some really incredible resources. So those are the kinds of funds that we'll continue to seek out in these early years. And then there are some opportunities long-term with carbon markets. We know that there's a lot more to learn about how those work, how to ensure that they're verifiable, and bringing the most benefits. But we are going to continue to look into that as an option. Of course, I don't need to mention to this crowd that climate change is also really expensive. And so this cost is probably nothing in comparison to what it will cost to clean up from natural disasters, keep houses cool during heat waves, etc. And this cost also includes building out employment opportunities and ensuring that we're paying living wages to the folks who are working in these industries. So the current status of seed collection in Minnesota is that most folks who are seed collecting, many of the folks, I should say, are older. There aren't enough people collecting tree seeds, and there's an opportunity to improve the genetic diversity of tree seeds being collected. Pictured here is a Climate Corps member named Sydney, who's collecting from a yellow birch, I think. Knowing that we need a big diversity of species and genetic diversity, so lots of parent trees being collected from, is something that we think we'll continue to push for. We're already working with the University of Minnesota Duluth on better understanding success rates when we're collecting seeds from southern Minnesota and then growing them out in northern Minnesota. Tracking those results is really critical, as well as tracking where seeds are being collected and where they're being grown in general. So we're building a database to better track seed collection. And then, of course, bringing more folks into the fold in terms of the job skills needed to collect seeds. So we're partnering with the Climate Corps and other job skills training programs to ensure that folks who will be in these positions in 5 to 10 years have the skills needed to collect seeds. And then actually Eli and I are working together on opportunities to train professionals in tree seed collecting. So we're just going to need a lot more seeds to create a lot more seedlings. We estimate we'll need about 780 million seedlings total. That's a really conservative number and a really high stocking rate that won't be appropriate for all the different kinds of reforestation that we see being a part of this initiative. For instance, Oak Savanna will certainly not be have stocking rates that high. But our current level of seedling production in the state of Minnesota is about 6 million seedlings per year. We're going to need to ramp that up to get to be a little closer to 48 million seedlings per year. And we think we can do that by working alongside all of the incredible nurseries, state nurseries, commercial nurseries, tribal nurseries, and boosting the capacity of small growers to get us all the seedlings that we need. As someone who purchased seedlings for a number of years for the floodplain forests along the Mississippi River, I know that it's really difficult to get the species that you want, the sizes that you want, stock types that you want, and in the quantities that you need. And so we're trying to figure out some creative solutions there to ensure that folks doing reforestation have an easier time of that and don't end up having to purchase seedlings from other states or from, 10 different nurseries, because that becomes really burdensome to track. We also want to make sure, like I've kind of been saying, that we are planting the rainbow. So we see opportunity for, of course, all of our native species alongside increasing the diversity of species, starting to include some species that are successful in southern Minnesota, the inclusion of fruit trees, food orchards, and ensuring that we have really strong diversity to build the resilience of the forests that we are creating. So pictured here on the left is some folks from Project Sweetie Pie planting, I think, a plum tree. There's bur oak acorns in the middle that have been collected from lots and lots of different parents. And then on the right is a series of yellow birch seedlings grown out by our forest assisted migration program in northeastern Minnesota. So boosting the capacity of all these different kinds of plantings is a big part of Minnesota Million. And I'd be curious, if we have some time for discussion, to talk to you all more about species you see being successful, species you'd like to see, and of course, how we can better create systems to get seedlings to folks who need them. This is a bit of a visual for those of you who prefer a graph of how we see this ramping up taking place. So here we are at the end of 2022. We're continuing to work with these partners from the state forest nursery, commercial nurseries, and tribal nurseries to increase their capacity. The fundraising that we need to do will continue for the next few years. And we think we can kind of gradually start to increase the numbers of seedlings being produced in Minnesota, working with all three of these entities over the next few years. And I think it's really going to take all of these partners together to get the seedlings that we need to meet this kind of audacious goal. Of course, there's a number of assumptions here, and the further out we get into the future, the less we know. But the USDA grant that we were just awarded is a huge piece in terms of building out the capacity for smaller farmers and for kind of helping the systems that exist better talk to each other to increase the capacity here. So where are we going to be? What does the reforestation opportunity really look like? What kinds of land are we talking about? What kinds of reforestation practices are we talking about? So we're really inclusive when we think about this. We see a huge opportunity to reestablish forests, woodlands, and savannas on private land. There's a lot of opportunity to partner with the Board of Water and Soil Resources, for instance, in reforesting riparian corridors and buffers, working with the Army Corps of Engineers to reforest in floodplain forests. We also see opportunity for shelter belts and windbreaks to add to our capacity to store carbon in the agricultural matrix. Like I mentioned before, urban areas are a really important and critical part of this, as well as sort of the natural spaces in between urban and suburban areas. And then of course, public lands and partnering with those agencies to ensure we can support their work. About 90% of the land within the reforestation opportunity area is on private land. And we know that private landowners are certainly not a monolith. We do need to look into some really good incentives to ensure that private landowners who want to reforest have the means that they need to do so. One of the best tools in our toolbox there is partnering with soil and water conservation districts and state and private forestry. So ensuring that those organizations have the capacity building that they need to go out to different landowners, walk the land with them, and talk about what's possible. So we've been working with the Minnesota Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts on what that could look like, and how we can support private landowners, and in particular for SWCDs, how we can support their tree sales that many of them do in the spring to ensure that they're able to meet the huge demand from private landowners. And then acres. How do we get up to 1 million acres? Our current reforestation rate is 6,000 acres per year. And this is just going to take some time to ramp up. We see that we'll need to get up closer to 50,000 acres per year for 20 years in order to reach this audacious goal. But that doesn't have to happen tomorrow. And we're still working on building out a broad and strong foundation to make that work possible. Again, here's more of a visual for folks who like a graph. We see a continuation of the 6,000 acres per year rate this year, obviously next year. In 2024, we're really excited that our colleagues at the Board of Water and Soil Resources were awarded an LCCMR grant to ramp up reforestation on a watershed basis. They're working with the Rum, Red Eye, and Long Prairie watersheds to kind of align with the One Watershed, One Plans there, and add an additional 3,000 acres on top of that 6,000 that I believe will come online in 2024. I think that's a really brilliant model, and we intend to continue that hopefully in future years, and maybe with an additional proposal like that going online in 2025, we can see a doubling of that 6,000 acre number. But again, as we get further and further into the future, we're not exactly sure how this will look, and know that we need to continue to bring on more partners, and we're going to need great incentives for those private landowners. The report I mentioned at the beginning, back in 2010, put together by the Minnesota Forest Resources Council, estimated that for landowners to be incentivized to plant trees, it takes about $114 per acre. So we're going to need to continue to find creative solutions to get those incentives to landowners on private land. So this is just sort of a bit more of a shorthand of the whole process as we see it. We are growing the capacity for seed collection amongst young people. So this is a picture of conservation interns through Urban Roots, which is a nonprofit in St. Paul that we worked with to train in tree seed collection practices. We know we're going to need to train young people who are just at the beginning of their careers to have these skills, but we also want to work to train folks who are currently professionals in the field. So those are both really critical. We also want to make sure that tree seed collection is done in a good way with great genetic diversity so that we can have healthy seedlings, increase that seedling production, and then planting in the appropriate places for the appropriate species out on the landscape, and then maintaining those species or those trees and forests into the future. One of the things that we've been discussing with the tribal nations and indigenous partners we've been meeting with is the need to ensure that we are growing forests and not just planting trees. So consideration being made for the herbaceous layer, for tree and shrub layers and thinking of the forest system as a whole. And so we're continuing to look at how that vision will take shape. But as you can see here, there's a lot of opportunities for job creation and a lot of different ways for folks to be involved in this process. We're really excited by the alignment with different state agencies and other initiatives. Like I mentioned, there was an award to the Board of Water and Soil Resources that supports this work. That will be kicking off this coming spring. There has been a resolution through the Minnesota Forest Resources Council acknowledging that our state's nurseries could increase and need to increase their capacity to grow seedlings. The Minnesota Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts board supports our work, and I've been lucky to meet with many of the area SWCDs to talk about what they need to increase the tree sales in the spring and their outreach to private landowners. And then also excited at these two state plans and the climate action, or at the state plan and the climate action framework, which mention the Minnesota Million Goal. So we are still in the process of establishing a coalition. We are in conversation with the tribal nations and indigenous partners, working towards relationships with community organizations in particular, as we look at implementing this USDA award that we just got. We know that we're going to need local implementation teams to get the trees on the ground in a good way. And we're excited to continue to raise funds, and in particular in the next 4 years focus on seed collection and tree seedling growing capacity. So that is actually the end of my talk. We're really excited to have these following partners on board, and Lane or Eli, I'm wondering if there's been some questions in the chat.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Thanks for the talk, Mary. This has been really good. And we do have a number of good questions in the chat. Some of them, maybe not surprisingly, given the ambition behind your vision here, but some of them are a little bit skeptical about how to actually get all this done. So let's talk a little bit about that. We can start way up on the North Shore. Matt Petz-Jaguar asked, about labor availability. Lots of rural communities in greater Minnesota are experiencing profound labor shortages, and the statewide unemployment rate is at record lows. So where are the workers for these projects going to come from? And that question came in early. You talked a little bit later in the talk about some of that, folks early in their careers and some of the partnerships that you've developed. But any thoughts on the labor force?
I think that, you know, I don't claim, I'm sitting here in Minneapolis and my office is in downtown Minneapolis. I can't claim to have solutions for those labor shortages in greater Minnesota. And so I think, you know, I'd welcome a conversation with this person to better learn about that issue and figure out how we can meet those needs together. I do think bringing in a bigger coalition of partners can be part of the solution to that. And yeah, I guess I don't have a great answer to that right now.
Okay, and things will change over time, I would think. A question from Mark Herwig. Are you taking into account forest self-seeding via wind, birds, etc., or would too many quote unquote wrong trees take hold? You talked a lot about genetics and so.
No, I think that's really, really key. And one of the things that we're looking at is how we can build forests, reforest adjacent to existing successful forested areas through, you know, protection from deer and beaver, and just letting natural regeneration take place. I think that's going to be a really critical solution, especially as we're trying to get to scale. And in some locations, and in particular with my experience working with cottonwood trees along the Mississippi River, one of the biggest barriers to natural regeneration is just protecting little seedlings from herbivory. And so I know that Dr. Marcella Wimler-Campione presented at one of these webinars a few months ago, and I've been in conversation with her about her research on that topic, and how we can implement protection strategies to get that natural regeneration.
Yeah, I actually was hoping the conversation would go there, and I wonder if you can build on that, or if you have thoughts on that. There's been some criticism of big planting projects like this internationally,
Yes.
and maybe also here, that center on the idea that we really focus on getting seedlings in the ground, but that's only the first step. And obviously you're aware of this, you've talked about it, but as you're thinking about, as TNC, I mean, is thinking about this really audacious goal, as you've described it, what are your thoughts? I mean, are you planning, or in what ways are you planning, or how should we collectively as a community be thinking about how we're going to keep those seedlings alive? It might involve, obviously, like you just said, browse protection early on. It might involve watering early on until those seedlings have deeper roots. It might involve different kinds of protection as well. So any thoughts on not just getting them in the ground, but how to keep them alive?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be the goal from the very beginning, and really like something that we have to fundraise for and plan for. In the work that I did along the Mississippi River, it became really clear that what works in upland areas does not work in floodplains. So, for instance, using tree tubes in the floodplain often results in just losing them due to floods, can result in issues with mold and the trees getting staying too wet within that kind of enclosed space. And so, we're really going to need to figure out localized solutions for the site where we're planting. In the floodplain, what we landed on is using lightweight fencing, and that tended to be the right solution. But I think, and getting back to the question about workforce, I think we're going to need more people who have the skills to care for trees. And I think it also involves a bigger conversation with funders about what it actually takes to grow forests. Because you're right, there's a lot of huge, huge initiatives looking at planting trees. Many of those are planting just row upon row of non-native trees in kind of a plantation setting. That is not what Minnesota Million is intending to do. I really think that the consideration of the full forest system is critical to that long-term survival and maintenance.
And Mary, I think that's a good response. And I'm not sure you need to add here, but I'll just mention another comment that came in. Some areas have a legacy of overly dense plantations that then have health issues, lack resilience, and lack markets for commercial thinning. So how do you avoid planting too densely? The last thing we need is thousands more acres of unhealthy plantations. So again, obviously you're aware of that. You've just discussed it. I just wanted to bring that up. And if the person who asked that question felt that it wasn't adequately addressed, they can put something else in the chat. Another question that kind of relates to workforce, and I find this interesting. I think I share some concern about workforce. Absolutely. I mean, obviously, it's a barrier. But I think one would hope that a lot would change within the community that would increase our capacity. And so as we talk about these goals are not going to occur in isolation. Along with this funding will come opportunities to increase the workforce. And Mary, you already mentioned how you and your team are thinking about that. But here's the question. It's kind of long. On the same subject, every picture shows volunteers planting, assuming very optimistically that they could plant 20% of the 39 million seedlings. That would leave 30 million seedlings to be planted by professional planters. I calculate that would require 300 to 400 professionals who can plant 2,000 trees a day, every day for 45 days. Does this project seek to increase the pool of professional vendors, and how? There are near zero in Minnesota currently. Again, Mary, TNC is not going to solve every one of these problems, but any additional thoughts beyond what you've already said, or not?
This gets to kind of like some of my personal philosophy when it comes to hiring in the natural resources world. We hear so often, or I've heard so often, why don't we have enough candidates? What's happening with our candidate pool? Why can't we get qualified folks? And in particular, when different entities have, diverse hiring goals, I think that we really need to think much bigger. We need to be compensating folks fairly for the work that they're doing so that we can compete with other industries. We need to be considering our work alongside partners rather than dictating the work to them, so that we can bring along new partners who have contacts with young people who want to work in this field. And I think we need to build a community of practice that folks want to be a part of. And that involves a lot more engagement a lot earlier in processes. And we're really attempting to do that. The best that we can with this initiative is build a coalition that is leaderful and better understand the needs of the many rather than dictating what we think is best.
Great, thanks, Mary. I know this one will take you into your comfort zone a little bit. A couple of questions about reforestation in the floodplains, or maybe just one. So, are reforestation efforts in the floodplain forest due to, or excuse me, how effective are those reforestation efforts in the floodplain forest due to challenges of reed canary grass, flooding regimes, manipulations of pools, and so on the Mississippi River? So specifically floodplains, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm really lucky to be in conversation with Andy Meyer over at the Army Corps of Engineers about this. And floodplain reforestation is its own whole thing. Luckily, there are folks who do specialize in that. What we've seen is that we need larger trees, larger stock. So looking at, even like 5-foot bare root trees really increases survival rates. I think, of course, limiting competition early in the kind of first years after planting for those trees. But it's a lot more input of time and resources than I think you'll see in upland areas. But I think, the jury is still out as far as like some of the best practices. And I think there's a lot more research to be done on using tools like exclosures from predation and better understanding deer and beaver populations and the way that they're moving, and really thinking about natural regeneration, because it does happen under the right conditions in floodplains. And in particular, how do we partner with the Army Corps on their drawdowns to take advantage of those moments to reforest? So yeah, there's a lot more I could say there, but
yeah, there's a lot to be discussed here. It's just an interesting topic. Someone pointed out in I think this was a private Zoom chat, the NRCS Conservation Stewardship Program pays through 5-year contracts for landowners to implement different conservation practices. Conceptually, private landowners could be paid through this program to plant and protect tree seedlings and then manage stand density over time. Money's always a good incentive. So that's not new. That's something that's been around. At least cost sharing and financial incentive programs like that are well established and have been quite effective over the years at getting various kinds of conservation practices done. And mobilizing people to do it themselves obviously has some benefits and some downsides. Maybe success rates or wouldn't be quite as high. At least there are reasons to think that might be the case. And on the other hand, those landowners are really invested. It's their land. Those are their seedlings, and they might work a little bit harder and might be more invested in the success. So you could imagine both of those outcomes happening. I think there's good reason some skepticism, but also a need for kind of a positive vision. And if this is something that we collectively want to do and really see value in, then I think some of these solutions are going to emerge on their own.
Yeah, well, and I think like as this sort of gets off the ground, and there are the so-called low-hanging fruit landowners who are just kind of champing at the bit to incorporate forests on their landscapes, as they as we connect them to those cost share programs or other incentives and kind of get things going, I hope for a bit of a snowball effect to take place.
Yeah, I think there's reason to expect that. Mary, I may have already asked you this. I've moved this question from my not yet asked to my asked list, but I don't think I asked it. Have you talked at all about direct seeding? So particularly in southern Minnesota with heavier seeded species, direct seeding is used a lot as an alternative to seedling production and planting. Of course, I don't know, but maybe that requires an even larger supply of seed, which could constrain seed collection efforts and so forth. But any thoughts on direct seeding as a strategy? Your talk is really focused on planting seedlings.
No, I think direct seeding is absolutely going to be a part of this where appropriate. I've been talking a lot about the floodplain forest. Direct seeding in the floodplain doesn't really work typically, but obviously there's locations where that's appropriate, especially if you compare it with protection from herbivory. And so yeah, I'm just excited to continue to explore how we can grow the skills for tree seed collection amongst more people, so we can get more seeds, and so we can better kind of like distribute those seeds to where they're needed, working closely with the state nursery on their capacity to act kind of as a distributor, and they have really great facilities to clean and process seeds. So how can we kind of centralize all of that so that more folks can get the seeds that they need for the work that they're doing?
Great. And we'll take a few more questions here. There are still several others coming in, which is great. So Mary, a couple of questions about numbers and kind of what counts toward the million acres. So there was a question that I'm not actually seeing right now, but I saw it earlier. There's a question about when you're counting acres planted, are you counting say acres that might be replanted after a clear cut? So that's not that's not afforestation. That's not adding new forest land acres, because that was previously forested. Does that count? And before you answer that, there's another question here about, I'd like to see some sweetening of natural regeneration and cutovers. And I think what this person is referring to is supplemental planting among, in the midst of natural regen. They'd be difficult to track and protect, but you'd be more likely to get trees on the right site and succeed in establishing seed sources for natural regen. I rarely see opportunities for large block plantings of this type. So first of all, would that count if you were planting into an already forested area just after a harvest?
Yeah.
And yeah, thoughts on those?
That gets at like some of the questions that the current coalition of partners has been discussing about how we're going to handle the loss of ash trees in Minnesota alongside this work. So knowing that we're, proposing this reforestation work alongside this huge forest loss, how can we start to think about reforestation in black ash dominated landscapes? I know that there's a number of, pilot projects. I know there's in Michigan, is it the Ottawa National Forest where there's some planting kind of like in current black ash dominated areas. I think that that's really interesting, and I'm curious to learn more about it as a practice that we include. Will planting after clear cuts count? That is a question for our coalition to answer, not me by myself. And I'm going to take this opportunity to kind of acknowledge that, balancing the needs of the many is really making this work really challenging, and also I think is going to enhance it. And so, when you propose a large scale project, you kind of end up picking your challenges. And so we've chosen the challenges associated with working as a coalition. And so I guess that's just a way of explaining that I don't have a great answer to that question.
I think it's understandable, Mary, where you're talking about, I mean, this talk is about system change.
Yes.
It's not about, a planting project. It's about changing. It's about huge investments that require mobilizing a lot of people for a long period of time. You're talking about decades. And there are a couple of questions here about some of your modeling, like what's the basis of your stepwise increases in estimated production numbers 20 years out? And you can speak to that. You already said, well, I mean, obviously, as we all understand, it gets harder to predict anything the further out you go into the future. And not to put words in your mouth, but I'm guessing that, like you've already said, you're anticipating that momentum will build, and as it becomes clearer that there are viable markets for these things, if indeed there are viable markets, if these investments that we're hoping to see come into play, then markets will respond and so on. Do you have anything further to add to about the about the basis of those stepwise increases in 2031 or 2042, or is it just what I said, that you're hoping and anticipating that as markets emerge to buy those, as demand emerges, supply will emerge as well?
Yeah, it is a lot of fiction, but it's based on our hopes for different sources of funding to kind of come online, and those opportunities. The ones that we know now are easy. We know there's going to be 3,000 more acres coming out of this LCCMR grant, for instance. But as we look further into the future, obviously we can't predict what kind of funding and resources we will get. I will say, as we're looking at the next 4 years, with this USDA funding source for seeds and seedlings, we are really focusing in on building a model where we can get SWCDs more seedlings from local growers, and thinking about that whole landscape of, we're working with a series of farmers who may be vegetable growers but want to take on tree seedlings as an additional source of revenue. So connecting them to SWCDs to get those seeds to market is one piece of this way bigger puzzle. But yeah.
We're not going to be able to ask every single question of Mary. We'll do a couple of more and then we'll wind down. But I would draw folks' attention, and of course, Mary, I can share with you the full Zoom transcript. You might be interested in seeing all of these written out when you're not having to think on the fly and try to answer them all. But there's a good comment here. Greg Snyder mentions that Minnesota DNR Forestry is in the process of hiring a full-time seed procurement specialist to coordinate the harvest and collection of tree seed from Minnesota forests. That's one of many investments that we're hearing about. And obviously this $5 million grant that Mary has mentioned is going to really launch some of these efforts. The University of Minnesota Sustainable Development Partnership up in Northeast Minnesota, led by David Abaz, is doing some work that is aiming to mobilize farmers, individuals to collect seed, and then farmers to grow them out. And they've had some success developing just a totally different model from what we're used to, which is concentrated, centralized production organized by DNR. And like you're saying, Mary, we're going to need, if this is going to work, it's going to be an all hands on deck. We got to try everything. And some of those ideas are easy to scoff at a little bit, like, come on, is that really going to work? And I admit that some of those thoughts have crossed my mind, but we're going to have to try everything. And there are good reasons to think that some of those models actually might work a little better than we might have thought. There are incentives built into those things where farmers, it's hard to have a farm and, carved out of the rocks in northern Minnesota, and any opportunity to diversify their production portfolio and so on is going to be embraced by farmers. And so there might be incentives that emerge in ways that that we don't think of because we haven't seen them in the past. At least one can hope that that might be the case.
Absolutely. And that's what we're seeing too, is I'm talking to small farmers. I'm hearing folks say, I would way rather grow trees than tomatoes. I'm so sick of tomatoes. I've like heard that. And, you know, I would never underestimate the power of a small farmer, you know, with that kind of grit and gleam in their eye, you know, to make some really huge changes. And it is small scale. And I think like, you know, it is all a both and I think that building out those systems to be bigger alongside figuring out, you know, there's a role here for huge commercial growers too. And
goodness, yeah.
You know, like I just really, to be clear, this is not all about small growers. It is about growing the capacity of small growers and supporting our really amazing existing Minnesota nurseries. And figuring out where the gaps are and how we can meet them as a coalition. So, yeah, I think that's kind of all I have to add there.
Great. And I think we're going to call it there. This has just been terrific. My goodness. I want to thank folks for posting so many questions. Again, we didn't get to all of them. And if we didn't get to yours, I'm sorry. I had a little bit of trouble sort of copying and pasting. And as I said, some things seem to have disappeared from my list, which sorry about that. But I really want to thank folks for those questions. And Mary, I want to thank you for both a great talk and your willingness to do your best. These are tough questions. And I think what I'm excited about with this work is that, you know, change doesn't happen unless we develop a vision for change and unless people really start working. And there are going to be a lot of ideas that we try and that fail in efforts like this that are huge and involve a lot of different people, including some people who aren't traditional players in the communities that we all work in. And it's easy to be skeptical about a lot of this, and there's good reason to be skeptical, and it's beneficial to be skeptical because that skepticism is going to push all of us to think harder about how to solve those problems. So I really appreciate folks engaging with these issues, and I'm excited to see where this goes. I appreciate TNC's leadership in this area, and I think it's going to put us in good hands. So who knows what the future holds, but I think we have to be proactive and thinking ahead about what we can do. And I think all of us, at least most of us I don't know everybody on this webinar, but I think we'd all like to see expansion, or at least stemming of any loss of forest land. Over the years, we've heard about conversion of ag lands in Hubbard County and maybe other places to ag production. And, you know, a vision like this and mobilizing to change some of those incentives can really make a big difference. And so it's important that we do what we can do. So Mary, thank you again for a great talk. Thanks to the audience for a terrific and really large number of questions. Those of you who want continuing education credits for today, I've put that link into the chat a couple of times now. You should see it. I'll put it right in the end now. So if you're looking for it, you'll see it there. We are recording this as always. And unfortunately, Lane Mosier, who was eager to talk to you a little bit about our 2023 webinar series, had some meltdowns, he said, at home with his kids. So he's not here to do that. I'm not prepared to do that right this minute, but suffice it to say that we're really excited. We've got a great series coming up in 2023. I know that our January webinar will feature Jeff Larkin from Pennsylvania. If you were at our Natural Disturbance Summit a few weeks ago, Jeff was there, but he had some technical issues. So we're bringing him back in to talk about a landscape level model of forest management, this shifting, oh goodness, the term is dynamic forest blocks. That's what it is. Really interesting approach that I think has good potential application here in Minnesota to balance timber production and wildlife habitat management, and a number of other good presentations coming up in our 2023 series. So I'll leave it at that. Mary, thanks again. This has been great. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your week. Happy holidays. And we sure look forward to seeing you in 2023. Hey, wait, one last thing I have to say. Forest and Wildlife Research Review, Research and Practice Review is going to be awesome. It's coming up January 11th. You'll see it right on the front of our website, and we encourage folks to register. It's going to be terrific. That's all I've got. Thanks again, Mary. Bye, everybody.